Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And once you're on there, you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guests for this episode are Dr Kate Herrity and Dr Jason Warr. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. So, Jason, you've been nominated to introduce yourself first, I believe, and then we'll go over to Kate. So tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Okay, so my name's Dr. Jason Warr, obviously. I'm a senior lecturer at Montford University in the Division of Community and Criminal Justice. I've kind of been a criminologist for a number of years, although I started off in the kind of philosophy realm. But really my kind of interests are in and around prisons, core criminological theory, the philosophy of science, and the kind of sociology of power really is kind of where my interests are. So not only do we have the book out, Sensory Criminologies, Sensory Penalties, which we're discussing today, but also I've got a book out recently which is on forensic psychologists who work in prisons, and it explores the kind of power, prison and vulnerability in terms of those regards. So that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jason. Kate, tell us all about yourself.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting us. I am Dr Kate Herrity. I only finished my PhD in 2019, so I've come all the way through school as a mature student. I did spend a term as a module leader at De Montfort alongside Jay, but I'm now and until 2024 the Andrew W. Mellon and King's College Cambridge Junior Research Fellow in Punishment. I am primarily concerned with extending the research I did for my doctorate, where I used oral ethnography to explore the significance of the soundscape in a local men's prison. So I'm particularly interested in working at those borders between criminology and other topics, how we go about understanding how we know and what we know, sensory criminology and emotions, with a particular focus on sound and music in prisons. So prisons are really my thing, not dissimilarly from Jay.
Thank you. And I was really interested as you were describing what you're just doing there. Do you consider yourselves sociologists or criminologists or psychologists or a bit of everything?
Well, I think for me, primarily I'm at the borders of kind of philosophy, sociology and criminology. I think I'm probably bordering those. So, a great deal of my kind of research has kind of focused on and has utilized sociological kind of methods and sociological kind of input. So my book, which was an extension of my doctoral thesis, is really kind of utilizing both kind of Foucaultian and kind of Bourdieuian kind of theory, theory. So yeah, I kind of hover in that kind of territory between those. I don't know. What about you, Kate?
I guess if I tend to refer to myself as a criminologist, insofar as I identify with any one specific field, and I think of criminology as more of a field than a discipline because it's so new and touches upon so many other different areas of study and academia, which is really why it appeals to me. So I would call myself a criminologist, a creative sociologist at a push, a bit of a magpie, really.
Creative sociologist. I like that. I like that. And Jason, you just mentioned influences Pierre Bourdieu and Foucault. For both of you, is there anyone else that really kind of influences your work, would you say?
Oh my. So many. It depends really what stuff. I mean, in terms of music in prison, there are a lot of people doing really interesting stuff at the moment. Lots of people in Scotland who are doing very interesting stuff and associated with the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. And I like borrowing from anthropology there. So people like Ben Harbert, who has done some really interesting work in Angola prison in Louisiana. So I like things like that. In terms of sensory stuff, again, there isn't much precedent in criminology. So people who work in sound studies have been particularly informative and influential. The anthropologist Stephen Feld, whose work on song and social organisation has been incredibly influential and important. But the list goes on in terms of particularly anthropologists and anthropological work. Jason.
I mean, I think for me, like Kate, so because criminology, one of the beautiful things about criminology is that it does it kind of cuts across the borders of so many other kind of disciplines. So, I mean, I think for me, certainly in terms of the sensory stuff that we've produced in this book, I think, my kind of real influences there were, the work that was produced by Klassen, for instance, where she argued that, there had been the subsuming of sensory kind of research under a kind of westernized oculocentric focus in the social sciences and in particular. So I think, really informed by her work, but also a kind of philosopher particularly called Serres, who was trying to distinguish the kind of sensory from kind of phenomenology that existed with some of the kind of key thinkers in that regard. But also, I suppose, if we're going to go back to classical sociology, Simmel and his sociology of the senses is really the kind of has been a significant influence, I think, on me personally.
Thank you. So you've already mentioned it a few times already, but let's get into it. Your new book, Sensory Penalties, it's hot off the press. Is that right? Just came out in February?
Just come out, yeah. It's already in a couple of libraries. I've noticed it's been in Cambridge Uni's library for a couple of weeks now, although they're copyright deposit. But yes, we got our copies yesterday, so I'm still given to picking it up and looking at it longingly.
Your little baby.
It has a very pretty cover. It does.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, I've seen the cover. It looks really, really good. So who wants to give the synopsis, a basic outline to start with, and then we'll dissect how it got started and what you look at.
I will try and be succinct and then make a mess of it, and Jake can come in and do it better. The idea of the book is really to explore those sensory aspects of experience in the research field that often remain in field notes or exchanged anecdotally, that we don't find any room for or tend not to have much room for in academic writing or discussion. And the idea behind that is that actually better accounting for sensory experience is closer to the way in which we actually make sense of our environment, both in terms of the natural world and our social situation and circumstances. So if I was to make a very simple allusion, when you walk into a cafe or a library, you recognise from the sensory scape which you're greeted with certain cues for shaping and governing your behaviour that allow you and help you to navigate those spaces. So the idea was to go to various people and ask them to revisit those field notes and those experiences, and to write in terms of what those particular sensory aspects of normally places of confinement, because that's our primary interest. We are prison studies and we are people and we are ethnographers. So that's where our gaze naturally lies and where we know most people. But not excluded to that, actually. We wanted to be as broad as possible, and to invite people to go back to those first principles and interrogate what those things taught them about the spaces they sought to understand. So that was the primary aim there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that we really needed people because in the wider kind of sociological field there had been this turn or a refocusing on the kind of on the sensory that occurred in it had never really disappeared from kind of anthropological circles, but in terms of sociology there had been this kind of quieting of sensory kind of focuses in terms of a lot of sociological work. So we wanted, and specifically in criminology, which had a visual turn, there was a lot of work being done in visual criminology, but the other senses had kind of been forgotten. So I think one of the things that we really kind of wanted to focus on and get our authors to focus on was the fact that we are embodied humans, and when we do kind of research or when we exist in particular kind of spaces, we exist within those spaces as entities of flesh and blood, as it were. So I think in terms of the book and the themes of the book, it was very much the idea that the kind of the political, the symbolic and the ideological facets of penality are not only are they inherent to places and processes of punishment and social control, but that they absolutely are encoded into the kind of sensorial outputs and transmissions that occur within those places and those processes. But then secondly, as places and processes of punishment and social control, that those entities are actually experienced sensorially by those who are subject to them, so those who are constrained by these environments, but also those who work within those environments, and indeed those who research them. And that lastly, if we really want to understand and theorize about these places and those processes of punishment and social control, we absolutely and necessarily need to account for those sensorial experiences, because if we don't, then we're missing real components of those environments that absolutely shape the experiences of those who live there, those who work there, and those who research there.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Kate. That is going to be the end of part one. In part two, we'll talk more about your book, Sensory Penalties.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hello and welcome back to part two of The Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr Kate Herrity and Dr Jason Warr about their book, Sensory Penalties. I was really interested in what you just mentioned in part one, because what my head was trying to work out is your methodology. How do you actually gather this kind of information? Because you sort of need to get inside people's heads, if that makes sense.
Or encourage them to talk from them. Generally speaking, the people that we asked to reflect on sensory experiences within the field did so retrospectively. So they weren't reflecting on research projects that had, in the process of doing them, sought to bring sensory experience to the fore. It was rather a re-interrogation that we were asking them to do of the data and reflections that they'd already gathered. Of course, the notable exception to that would be me, because my entire PhD was focused on exploring sound in a local men's prison. And I spent I spent nearly 8 months there, but I mean, I still have been going back periodically. I still know people who work there, and I very much hope to return to the prison I refer to as HMP Midtown, although obviously that is to disguise its specific identity. And what I was engaged with was a slow process of making sense, first of all, of the soundscape, of what this cacophony, as Henry Lefebvre talks about, the work of the rhythm analyst in interrogating these sounds of social life that sound immediately or on first hearing like a cacophony, an indistinct jumble of sounds, but which through the attentive ear you can slowly unravel and familiarize yourself with and understand and interrogate. And those have much to teach you about the composition of the social world. So my time initially was spent making sense of what I could hear and asking those around me to tell me what things meant to them. Sometimes the answer was nothing in particular. Often I got very thoughtful reflections from the men who would talk to me every day. HMP Midtown is quite unusual in that it's a very small prison, so it's comprised of one main wing. So I was able to spend all my time with that community, rather than most prisons are comprised of various blocks and wings, sometimes that different parts of the population are housed in, so vulnerable prisoners and so on and so forth. And this prison was just largely the one space with different sections of that large wing for vulnerable prisoners and for care and segregation unit, or segregation more accurately. So you go through this process. So, for example, what I normally do when I'm talking, if I want to use an example, is banging, which forms a huge part of prison life. You can hear banging all the time, particularly during association when members of the community will be out. So if, for example, you hear a rapid banging, that generally means either the regime's running late and I've got things to do, or I, being the person or people behind the door, think we should be out and you're not letting us out. We're agitated and irritated, and we want to convey that and spread that feeling around the wing to the community. And there are various other different bangings and so on and so forth that have different meaning depending on context and who is doing them. Once you've gone through that process of sense making, you reach an additional level of familiarity, or what I term attunement, which I borrow from organisational theory as I do sense making, to reach a point where you can not only navigate what those mean, but you can also begin to interpret them and, or depending on what part you play in the community, affect the general emotion and feel or social climate of the space you inhabit. So, for example, laughter can be a good means of diffusing tension, and it's used sometimes quite, albeit unconsciously, but quite instrumentally in prison on occasion. So that's really the process I underwent.
Thank you, Kate. I might not include this because it's such a poor example, but as you were talking, I was just thinking, I've got a new puppy, okay, and the puppy has to spend a certain amount of time in his crate, and every single noise means something. You know, a key in a door, yeah, or a drawer opening, or a little tub of food, and how he makes those connections up. And I suppose if you are in one prison cell, you are relying very, very heavily on your hearing, aren't you?
You absolutely are, which is why, my focus on prisons was largely because I am fascinated by how prisons maintain such a potent symbolic force in our collective consciousness. Why is the prison so powerful? Why do we allude to it so frequently in art, in music? Why does it retain, and how does it retain this power and legitimacy when it's so problematic in so many ways? However, it also fortuitously so happens that because of the nature of prison, it's a particularly interesting place to explore sound, because for so many of the inhabitants of prison, so much of their daily life is conducted and conveyed through sound, because they're so physically limited, so can't see. And that it's not that dissimilar for staff who have to kind of navigate their way around a whole wing and discern potential trouble and violence at various points in the prison building. They also rely on sound.
Thank you. Jason, what's your sensory specialism? Is it sound as well, or do you focus on another area?
Well, I kind of, in the chapter that I wrote for the book, what I focused on was, I coined a really ugly word called captiception. But it's that kind of physical and sensorial sense of being captivated. So, the kind of the manner in which the environment actually feels captivating to the people that were in it. And what I use in the book is the example of someone being trapped within a cell whilst there's a fire raging around them on the wing more generally. And what you've got there is that kind of, that flooded kind of combination of smell, of sound, of heat, of vertigo, and all these different kind of sensory kind of inputs that go into making the feeling of the cell, or changing the feeling of a cell once people, once the kind of context changes. So all of a sudden, the moment that there is something threatening in the environment, it can change the very nature of your experience of the cell space that you're in. So on a day-to-day kind of, the hubbub of the day-to-day life in the prison, when your cell shuts, or where the cell door is locked behind you, all of a sudden that can offer you a certain sense of respite from the general kind of hubbub of the prison. But of course, the moment that a fire starts or something dangerous starts, all of a sudden that locked door is no longer, and the cell space is no longer a respite, it's a trap. So what I explore in the chapter is how the sensory components of that communicate very, very, very different ideas about the cell space and your experience within it. And of course, one of the things that, I wrote this chapter prior to COVID being the kind of, in the before times, before the reality of COVID really kind of hit us. And we know that so many prisoners, certainly here in the UK, that have been experiencing pretty much 23, if not 23 and a half hour a day lockdown. They've been locked into their cells where they cannot escape. So really that idea of kind of, where I used fire as an extreme kind of event to explore those realities, and these were accounts that had been given to me over years of kind of prisons research that I only really kind of put together once we had this book kind of on the go. But what we had was that, all of a sudden that same sense of trappedness, of a captiception, a kind of sense of being trapped, is something that's become more and more prevalent and more relevant in the wake of COVID becoming such a reality for people in prisons, and such a terrible reality for prisons. I think a report that was released by the Prison Reform Trust just recently, I think this week actually, has highlighted how that, the kind of sensory deprivation of pretty much of 23 hour a day lockup, which is, almost solitary confinement for many people, is having profound effects on people's mental health.
Yes.
And of course, we know that if it has a profound impact on people's mental health, there are all sorts of negative consequences for that in people in prison. But oddly, it also makes people more sensitive to the sound environment in prisons, for instance. So we know that, people with PTSD, people with anxiety and depression also become more sensitive to sensory input. So all of a sudden you're getting this rather vicious circle occurring in the prison between the kind of trappedness and then the other sensory kind of elements of that. That's what I was kind of interested in.
Thank you. And do you want to tell us a bit more about some of the other chapters perhaps you haven't mentioned? I know Bethany Schmidt's also one of the editors for the book as well.
Absolutely. She writes with Andrew Jefferson about their experiences and research in Tunisia, looking at the way in which that society in transition in the wake of revolution is reflected and impacts changing prison life and prison policy and how that manifests in the day-to-day. And of course, not being Tunisian, all of a sudden those other senses become incredibly important in order to not only communicate with the people. Obviously they have translators and so forth, but these things become much more important and central as a means of beginning to understand the environment that you're in, as it relates to the people you seek to understand. So that chapter looks at that and the sort of haptic aspects of sensory experience, because of course we are more inclined to talk about things in terms of the visual, but that's quite Western. That's by no means universal either. So there are broader implications to looking at the sensory that have the potential to disrupt those assumptions about hierarchies of experience and knowledge too, that we also discuss in the introduction, although there is by no means as much of the global south in evidence as we'd hoped. But, it's the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. So the book's broadly divided into 4 parts: making sense of the sensory, sensing the field, subverting the senses, and finally sensory reflections. So we go from Nicaraguan prisons and the power of silence and secrecy with Julienne Wiegels. We come back to the UK with Carla Reeves to explore probation-approved premises, largely working with people who have been convicted of sex offences as they try to acclimatise to the outside world. Vicky Canning talks about a triangle of confinement in Denmark, and she brings her abolitionist perspective to bear to talk about immigration confinement. Lisa Flower talks about the courtroom. Alison Young and Yvonne Dukes talk about Japan. Ian O'Donnell takes us to a prison he visited frequently in Ethiopia. Ali Fraser talks about the streets as an effective atmosphere. So we really do go, I shouldn't leave out Jen Pierce either, who talks about Caribbean prisons. So we really have travelled quite extensively around the globe.
Thank you very much for that. There's a great overview. So listeners might be thinking, right, where can I get hold of the book? So do you want to tell us a little bit more details about where people can pick up the text or read a little bit more if they want to find out about it?
Certainly. The book, the blurb, and a fairly generous excerpt can be downloaded from the Emerald website. If you Google it, that will be fine. The link is available, however, via our blog, which we began sometime before the book came out, as a means of expanding the conversation and inviting people who are maybe at a more junior point or not actually within criminology to reflect on various sensory experiences of aspects of criminological interest. So www.sensorycriminology.com has a page on sensory penalities where you will find that link. What I would say to anyone, I assume many of your readership are students, and academic books are, I'm afraid, frequently prohibitively expensive. Ours is no exception, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. However, if you recommend it to your libraries, it is free to you, and it is also then available for others to use it. So if you can't run to the cost, I'm hoping that at some point in the future we will have the opportunity to share a few copies via competitions and so forth, but watch this space. But in the meantime, my advice would be to please consider recommending it for your libraries, because the whole point of academic work is to share ideas and to do so freely. And it seems to me that limiting access to our ideas is an entirely self-destructive enterprise when all we want to do is reach out and further that conversation, which of course is very much what the blog is supposed to do and does do, actually. I'm really, really proud of the blog, and it's still going strong, and we have many contributors lined up and many more in the future, I hope. So that is freely accessible to everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kate. And I know there's a YouTube clip with yourself and Bethany as well that people can look up too, can't they?
There is, yes. It was a joy to do, and quite a number of people have looked it up, actually. If you are interested in exploring some of those sensory criminology ideas, where they come from, what the point was, what we hope to accomplish with it, that is a good resource, and also absolutely free, which is the best kind of resource.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I always ask, Kate, I know you're on Twitter. Jason, are you also on Twitter if people wanted to follow you?
Yeah, at Warr Criminology for me.
Kate Herrity for me, nice and simple and straight up. We do have a sensory penalties account as well, but that's more for the blog and so on and so forth.
Brilliant.
But yes, we are very active on Twitter.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today, and very good luck with the book and for the future as well.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Good luck with the puppy.
Thank you. Cheers. I appreciate it.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.